Imagine building a city into the side of a cliff, not a small settlement. A four-story stone complex with over 200 rooms, ceremonial chambers, storage vaults, and a water system engineered to survive drought. Now imagine, one generation later, walking away from it. Not slowly, not gradually. Within the span of a single human lifetime, an entire civilization that had thrived in the American Southwest for over 1,000 years simply stopped being there. No war, no invasion, no mass grave, just empty rooms, cold hearths, and pottery left neatly stacked, as if someone meant to come back. This is the story of the tribe that disappeared without a trace, and why the answer we've settled on might be more unsettling than any mystery. The people in question are the Ancestral Puebloans, sometimes referred to by the older, now discouraged term Anasazi. Between roughly 850 and 1150 AD, they built one of the most sophisticated societies in pre-Columbian North America, centered in a place called Chaco Canyon in what is now northwestern New Mexico. Chaco wasn't a small outpost, it was a hub. Massive multi-story stone buildings called great houses, some containing hundreds of rooms, rose out of the high desert. Roads, wide and perfectly straight, some stretching over 30 feet across, radiated outward for dozens of miles, connecting Chaco to smaller communities across the region. Archaeologists have found evidence of long-distance trade reaching all the way to the Pacific coast and deep into Mesoamerica. Turquoise, macaw feathers, cacao residue found in ceramic vessels hundreds of miles from where cacao naturally grows. This wasn't a primitive society scraping by in the desert. This was a civilization with astronomical knowledge precise enough to align entire buildings with solar and lunar cycles. The Sun Dagger petroglyph at Fajada Butte, for example, uses a specific arrangement of rock slabs to cast a dagger of light directly through the center of a spiral carving at solar noon on the summer solstice. That kind of precision doesn't happen by accident. It requires generations of careful observation and intentional design. And then, within roughly a century, they left. Not just Chaco Canyon, the broader network of ancestral Puebloan communities across the Colorado Plateau, including the famous cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, were largely abandoned by around 1300 AD. Entire regions that had supported dense populations for centuries were essentially empty within a few generations. For a long time, popular explanations leaned toward mystery, even mysticism. Vanished civilizations make for compelling stories, and it's tempting to reach for something dramatic. A curse, an unexplained catastrophe, a people who simply vanished into legend. But the archaeological and climatological evidence tells a very different story, one that's arguably far more disturbing, precisely because it's so mundane. The primary driver appears to have been sustained drought. Tree ring data, which allows researchers to reconstruct precipitation patterns with remarkable precision, reveals a series of severe droughts hitting the region in the late 1200s, including what's now referred to as the Great Drought, a multi-decade dry period beginning around 1276. For a society dependent on dryland farming in an already marginal environment, this wasn't a temporary setback. It was an existential threat repeated year after year, with no reliable end in sight. But drought alone doesn't fully explain the abandonment. Researchers studying the period have identified additional pressures compounding the environmental stress: soil depletion from centuries of intensive farming, deforestation from construction, and fuel needs stripping the surrounding landscape of resources, and increasing evidence of social and political tension including signs of violence and conflict in the archaeological record from this period. In other words, it wasn't one single catastrophe, it was a slow accumulation of unsustainable pressures, environmental, agricultural, and social, that eventually reached a breaking point. And when that breaking point arrived, the people who lived there made a decision that, in hindsight, looks less like disappearance and more like adaptation. They left, deliberately and in an organized way. Archaeological evidence shows migration patterns moving south and east toward the Rio Grande Valley and other regions with more reliable water sources. The people didn't vanish. Their descendants are very much still here, forming the ancestral roots of numerous modern Pueblo communities in New Mexico and Arizona today, including Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblo peoples, who maintain oral traditions describing this very migration. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the dramatic headlines. The tribe didn't disappear. The place did. And the distinction matters enormously, both historically and ethically. Framing this as a vanished civilization erases the living descendants who still carry this history forward, while framing it as an environmental migration tells a story that's arguably more relevant to understand today than any mystery ever could be. Here's the uncomfortable parallel worth sitting with. Chaco Canyon wasn't destroyed by an external enemy. It wasn't erased by a single catastrophic event. It was slowly rendered unlivable by a combination of climate stress and unsustainable resource use, until the accumulated pressure made staying no longer viable, and leaving became the only rational choice. Archaeologist Stephen Lexon, who has spent decades studying Chaco, has noted that the story of its decline reflects less a mystery than a pattern. Complex societies pushing environmental and social systems to their limits and eventually reorganizing, sometimes dramatically, in response. This isn't a uniquely ancient phenomenon. It's a pattern that recurs across history whenever a society outpaces the sustainable capacity of the land supporting it. Think about how this compares to modern conversations happening right now, about drought-stricken regions in the American Southwest facing similar water scarcity issues, about agricultural communities worldwide adapting to shifting climate patterns, about cities built in places that may not remain viable under future environmental stress. The Ancestral Puebloans weren't a primitive people who mysteriously vanished. They were a sophisticated society that recognized when a place had stopped being sustainable and responded the way any rational group would, by moving somewhere that could support them. Maybe that's the real story hiding inside this so-called mystery. Not that an advanced civilization inexplicably disappeared, but that when the environment that sustains a society quietly stops holding up its end of the bargain, even the most sophisticated societies eventually have to listen. The empty rooms at Chaco Canyon aren't evidence of a vanished people. They're evidence of people who knew when to leave, carrying their knowledge, their traditions, and their descendants forward into the next chapter, one that continues in living Pueblo communities to this day.